Tonight is not Jim Whitaker, who was at the Nuremberg War Trials. Jim had cataract surgery yesterday, so he will be our speaker in September. And he sent his extreme apologies. He didn't realize when he accepted that he had this surgery scheduled. And I guess like most of us, it was his wife that called me 15 minutes after I'd called, and he'd said, yes, I'll be there. And she said, I don't know what he's talking about. He's getting eye surgery the day before. But anyway, Jim will be here in September. The other bad news is Charlie Ollie was out of town and not able to open the museum for us tonight. So we did lose out on that one. But we did really come up with a crackerjack speaker who jumped in at the last minute to help us out. It's General William Burns, U.S. Army retired, and Jim joined the Army and was commissioned in the Field Artillery in 1954 and served in every type of field artillery unit that the U.S. Army had to offer. So he's quite an expert on that. But he served, of course, in West Germany in the artillery. He went into staff work. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. The thing that struck me about his resume that President George Herman Walker Bush appointed him as his personal envoy to Russia when we were negotiating the disarmament of their nuclear weapons. But he also was Deputy Commander of the War College out of Carlisle. And what he's going to talk to us about tonight, as you saw in the brochure, is the United States Army Artillery in World War II and how it was the precursor of what we have for artillery today. So, General, you're on.
Thank you, sir. What I'd like to do, and I hope this does not bore the non-artilleryman here, but what I would like to do is talk just a bit about field artillery, what it has done, and what it might be able to contribute in the future. Field artillery has never been a prominent part of the United States Army. First of all, because artillery was not really necessary during most of the 19th century, where the United States Army organized itself basically in the Indian Wars and in some of the other altercations on this continent. Artillery came into its own, of course, in the Civil War. The Battle of Gettysburg, in many ways, was an artillery duel. But artillery, because of other demands, was never a very large branch. And coast artillery, which was separate from field artillery in the 19th century, got the lion's share of the cannoneers, because it was determined at that time that the best way to protect our ports was to put coast artillery emplacements around the ports. None of them ever fired in anger from United States soil, but that was the idea at the time. From the technological point of view, artillery didn't change very much in the 19th century. We started with smoothbore cannons, and we ended with an awful lot of smoothbore cannons. When I was in Vietnam in '66, we had to, we were checking on equipment, and I got an inventory of what the Army had in reserve in artillery, and at that time, we still had 44 Napoleon 12-pounders considered as reserve. In other words, they were ready to be used. And we still had some cannonballs for them. So I suppose my first point is artillery is very conservative. By the end of the 19th century, though, some changes had taken place. We had begun to rifle our artillery weapons during the Civil War. We we had problems, of course, with smoothbore and the rifled weapons of that age, because the gun crew had to be rather nimble. The force of the projectile going out the barrel, of course, had a similar force back, and the howitzer generally came out of battery and rolled down the hill or something, had to chase it, bring it back up again. By the end of the 19th century, however, we had invented some recoil systems which absorbed that and allowed the howitzer to stay in one place. This was a major advance because that and being able to have a projectile which rotated through the tube and became more accurate, having the howitzer in one place made it more accurate because you knew where you were firing from every time. In the latter days of the 19th century, the early days of the 20th century, Congress, in its wisdom, as always, spent very little on the military. And the National Guard militia units of the day still pretty much had smoothbore weapons. There were a couple of regiments of regulars who had acquired a 3-inch gun, which was the American copy of the French 75. The French 75 was the first modern field artillery weapon, and we used that basically as our field artillery weapon in World War I. We acquired them from the French. We sent artillery units to France. They re-equipped the units with the 75. Now, that was great. The problem with the 75 gun, however, was that it
Go on, sir.
No, the orange. Push the orange bar.
Okay, gotcha. The French 75 gun was a great weapon. It fired about 7,000 yards. But as you can see, it had a box trail, which meant you couldn't elevate it very high. And therefore, its range was limited and its flexibility was limited because it couldn't fire over much of a hill in front of it. But the French 75 was an outstanding weapon of its time, and it was the weapon which we used in the period between World War I and World War II, and at the same time we liked it so much that we didn't spend any money to replace it. Now the French 75 was basically a horse-drawn weapon, and the field artillery of the day was quite satisfied with that. We had a number of traditionalists in the Army in the 20s who were satisfied that Congress was not appropriating money for mechanization. It was so bad in the 20s because the trucks that had been used in World War I had basically fallen apart. We went back to horses. But Ford Motor Company offered to provide for free enough trucks to outfit one field artillery battery for French 75. And they did. And this battery, to demonstrate the advantages of mechanization, made a cross-country trip, not cross-country, but from Fort Sill to the West Coast. And Congress and the military hierarchy were so impressed by that that they did nothing. So we had one battery of motorized artillery and a lot of horse-drawn units. And in 1940, just about all our field artillery units were French 75s pulled by horses. The problem, of course, going into World War II was that in the late 30s, we had other problems in the United States, and suddenly after the invasion of Poland, we began to rearm. And money was made available, but it takes time to rebuild or to build from scratch. There weren't enough trucks to go around to motorize everyone at the same time. There weren't enough trucks or track vehicles to provide the fledgling tank corps with its motive power and so forth. What I'd like to do is talk a little bit now about the World War II field artillery. And some of you, I know from talking to you, are quite familiar with that. I'm happy to say that my combat association was with 1st Division Artillery. And 1st Division Artillery, of course, is our oldest division and our oldest units and our oldest field artillery units. The oldest unit in the Army is the 5th Field Artillery. It was founded prior to the Revolution by Alexander Hamilton, and it has existed ever since. It has 2 battalions right now, both of them in Iraq, one with the 1st Division and one a separate battalion doing good work someplace. I was very fortunate and honored to be made the Colonel-in-Chief of the 5th Field, which is an honorific title, but I get to visit Fort Riley when the troops are back a few times a year and make speeches and so forth. In World War II, in the aftermath of World War II, a number of studies were done as to what was actually accomplished by the United States Army. And one of the major studies says that the greatest killer on the battlefield in World War II was field artillery in terms of number of casualties produced by any of the arms. But the field artillery was only 9.2% of the Army's strength at its height in World War II. But that meant almost 500,000 cannoneers, which is larger than the United States Army is today, even with reserves called up. So, field artillery was formidable both in firepower and in numbers in World War II. Now, because of some of the work done between the wars, at Fort Sill primarily, field artillery advanced technically tremendously from what it was in World War I. In World War I, we had the battery commander's system, where the battery commander would stand in a trench in front of his battery with a battery commander's telescope. Remember the telescope that really was a periscope that went up so you could see over the trench without sticking your head up. And he would identify targets and adjust fire onto the targets, and he would be basically standing on the same line of the guns, so what he saw was what the guns were aiming at and so forth. And it was a useful system, but it wasn't a very technically accurate system. And during the early days of World War II, a number of attempts and a number of field artillery units were made to try to improve that, and a number of devices were developed. What these devices allowed us to do was mass fires. We were the first Army that allowed its artillery to mass fires. Russian artillery, for example, Soviet artillery in those days, literally lined their cannon up hub to hub and fired. And you got massed fires because you had the front saturated. It took an awful lot of artillery weapons. We had many fewer artillery weapons, but we were able to move fires around the battlefield fairly accurately in World War II. In other words, you could prioritize your targets. You could have all of the division artillery or all of the battalion firing on one target, then move fairly swiftly to another target. And this is a tremendous advantage. U.S. field artillery was generally more accurate than the other sides and more accurate than most of our allies. The way we developed artillery in World War II was we stole good ideas from our friends and sometimes from our enemies. The most accurate field artillery weapon, field artillery cannon that has existed is the 8-inch howitzer. I was fortunate to command an 8-inch howitzer battery, an 8-inch howitzer battalion, and then a brigade with several 8-inch howitzer battalions in it. The 8-inch howitzer at 10 miles can put 6 rounds in this room. 6 rounds in succession in this room. Some of our missiles, of course, are much more accurate than that. But for a cannon and for a relatively cheap round, it's pretty accurate. The industrial capacity, of course, of the United States was tremendous during World War II. Many would say that that's really what provided the necessary material so that we could win World War II. Because of that, we manufactured a tremendous number of field artillery weapons, and we had a tremendous number of field artillery battalions. And then field artillery in World War II was quite flexible. It was flexible in the sense that we could tailor artillery units to support the infantry and tankers in ways that other countries couldn't do. And this is because, first of all, we reorganized the Army in 1940-41. We went from the traditional square division, 2 brigades, each brigade had 2 regiments, a regiment of artillery. We broke up the regiment of artillery, organized artillery in battalions, organized the ground-gaining arms, if you will, into 3 brigade-sized units, 3 regiments in those days. And each regiment had a field artillery battalion associated with it, and then there was division artillery, medium artillery, and then heavy artillery with a corps that could be brought into play. So there was tremendous flexibility in the field artillery. As far as disadvantages, and there obviously were some, we waited too late to modernize. The last horse-drawn field artillery battalion was inactivated in the United States Army when I was a first lieutenant in 1957. Still had 1 horse, well, actually we had 2 horse-drawn outfits. And this was not because we were nostalgic about horses. It was just that we had not carried on the modernization that far. Well, yeah, we were nostalgic about horses. We didn't make that as a big issue. One of the problems of World War II was that the United States had a great advantage and great disadvantage being isolated in the Western Hemisphere. Great advantage because the other side had to come a long distance to get to us. The great disadvantage is we had to go a long distance to get there. And field artillery is heavy stuff. And of course, in World War II, everything went by ship. And the problems of moving large quantities of equipment, say a division-size load of equipment, were great. And one of the problems with both the North African invasion and the ultimate invasion of Europe was that delays were caused because of logistics, not because of lack of availability of troops at that time. And then training was always a problem. In basic training, an infantryman learns how to be an infantryman. In basic training, a field artilleryman learns only the rudiments of how to fire a cannon, accurately. To train a field artillery survey party takes time. It can't be done in a week or 2 weeks or a month. So the problems of integrating the availability of equipment, modernizing equipment to meet requirements, and training people to use the modern equipment was a formidable task in World War II, and it continues to be that kind of thing today. Now, what we had in World War II is rather interesting. There were 672 field artillery battalions in division artillery. 61 combat divisions. Now, we had more. We had 98, 99 divisions. But we had, at one time, the most we ever had were 61. We had a few that were in training and so forth, and we lost a few. We had, and these were all 75 in the early days of the war, and 105 howitzer battalions. These 9 were horse-drawn, because we started off the war with 2 cavalry divisions and a mountain division. Remember the mountain division in Italy? And the mountain division, of course, were horses and mules. And the cavalry division divisions were eventually dismounted, and the field artillery horses went the way of the cavalry horses. We had 224 155 millimeter field artillery battalions. Started out the war with a lot of World War I 155 Schneiders, howitzers. And then we moved into a more advanced U.S.-made howitzer. The Schneider was a French howitzer. We had 3 separate parachute field artillery battalions. These were with pack artillery, 75 millimeter howitzers, organized in, I think it was 7 crates and dropped from planes. We had 37 separate 105 battalions. These were battalions which were kept at corps and could be allocated to divisions to wait an attack or to reinforce a defense. Some of those started off as horse battalions. We had 72 separate 155 howitzers, and then we had 17 4.5-inch gun battalions. In World War II, we paired different kinds of calibers of artillery and used the same gun carriage for them because they were essentially the same weight. The 155 howitzer and the 4.5 gun were an example of that. The problem was that the 4.5-inch gun didn't work. It was a scatter gun. It would generally go in the direction you aimed it, but how far it went was the question. We still have 6 4.5-inch guns in the field artillery. They're lined up in a row at Fort Sill, and they're used for young officers to learn how to lay the battery. But that's their total use. We had 38 155 millimeter gun battalions. 155 millimeter gun would fire about 16, 17 miles, 18 miles. They were very effective. They had a very high muzzle velocity. With the Charge Super, they fired at the same, the bullet went at the same speed as an M1 rifle bullet, 2,800 feet per second. So it would go through a tank fairly easily. They weren't designed to fire at tanks, but they were very good at firing at bunkers and things of that nature. People didn't like the 155 gun. They said it wasn't accurate. Well, it wasn't accurate if you tried to use it like a 105 howitzer. If you didn't take time, make sure it was laid properly, make sure it was level, all the bubbles level, and so forth. But the first battery I commanded was a 155 gun, and I learned to like the weapon if you take time with it. The 8-inch howitzer battalions, we had 37 of them. In World War II, they were separate. They were corps artillery. Today, we have had 8-inch howitzers within divisions. The 8-inch howitzer and the 155 gun had the same gun carriage, might as well look at some pictures. The bottom picture is a 155 gun. The drawing is an 8-inch howitzer. The main difference in looks is that the one tube is a lot longer than the other. But it was I'm quite partial to the 8-inch howitzer. I commanded again a battery and a battalion and so forth. It was a very effective weapon. The only trouble is the towed version, which is the most accurate, takes 21 men, and it's labor intensive. When I commanded in the 50s, our 21 men were fairly easily obtained because the draft was on. The only problem in 127 men in the battery, 23 put an X on the payroll. They couldn't read or write. Today, that wouldn't work at all because we expect cannoneers to be computer literate, computer operators, and so forth. The 8-inch gun and a 240 howitzer were two more companion pieces. What's interesting about this particular weapon is that it came disassembled, came in two carriages because it was so big. This is a picture of the carriage that carries the tube on the bottom here. I'll move it up a bit. These were of extremely long range. The only problem is it took 6 to 12 hours to emplace them, and you had a steam shovel, literally a steam shovel in those days. It came with the battery. You had 2 guns per battery, and it took about 2 hours of steam shovel work to dig the hole to put the base assembly and the trails into the ground. Obviously, you didn't move these very often. We used these in Korea, and they quietly disappeared in the mid-50s from the inventory. One battalion of field artillery was interesting in Europe. It was made up of captured equipment. It was decided that the Germans had some pretty good equipment, so why don't we turn it around and use it against them? And that was a good idea. Unfortunately, they didn't capture enough of any single weapon to be able to organize a battalion, so the battalion had 3 or 4 different kinds of weapons, which created all sorts of problems, particularly resupply problems, because while we captured weapons, we didn't capture the ammunition to go with them. So it wasn't a very good idea. Then field artillery observation battalions, these were the battalions that were organized at the time and actually still exist as batteries to locate targets, to provide survey for field artillery units and so forth. Today, they're rapidly going out of existence because field artillery doesn't do survey anymore. Because every howitzer knows where it is. Every howitzer has GPS on it, global positioning system. So the howitzer knows where it is. Howitzer knows where north is. The computer in the howitzer has the history of the gun tube. It knows when it was calibrated, what the calibration data is. It has all the meteorological data, current meteorological data. It has data on tube memory and tube wear and so forth and so on. So every round fired by, say, a 155 howitzer today is fired using the very best data, and you don't, the field artilleryman here, you don't register. You just fire, and you hit the target. I had a chance to fire the new 155, been around about 5-6 years now, in about 2 years ago at Fort Sill. The crew is 3. There are no aiming posts. There are spades on the back of the track, which you can put down and use if you want, but the chief of section said he had never used them. He really wasn't too sure how they work. You are closed in as in a tank, so you can't see out, which unnerved me because you like to be able to see what you're doing, but you couldn't. There's no safety officer anymore because the chief of section will know if there's something unsafe because he has 3 computers and they can check each other and so forth. And each vehicle has, communication systems. So you don't lay wire in the battery area anymore. And if you're going down the road and you have a so-called hip shoot, you want to pull off the road and shoot, only one howitzer pulls off the road because one howitzer can fire a battery 1 round. It can fire 6 rounds. A howitzer can fire 6 rounds in a minute because it has an automatic loader, and it carries 35 rounds in the turret. So, if you want to fire at a target, one howitzer pulls out and shoots, and the other 5 continue down the road. So it's a different war, different army, and different field artillery. Let me simply conclude with a couple of general remarks. The basic howitzer of World War II, as I mentioned, was the 105. This is the one you found in divisions. This is the one you found in the greatest number, and so forth. The picture on the bottom is a picture from Fort Sill of 105. We still have, in the Army, there are still 2 National Guard divisions with 105 howitzers. In Vietnam, this is the M101 howitzer. We developed a lighter weight howitzer, which is supposed to be the answer to all our problems. It was lighter weight. It was made out of aluminum, and you know what aluminum does? It cracks very quickly. So while it was light, it didn't work. And it was used in airborne divisions for a while, and then it was quietly scrapped. We bought a British lightweight howitzer that actually works, and that's what our airborne division are using. The picture above is U.S. Marine Corps 105 howitzer. Marine Corps only uses the M101 because they like it. The M101s were bought in such large quantities that we haven't bought one actually since World War II. They cost $25,000 a piece. Can you imagine buying a cannon today for $25,000? And they're basically indestructible. Every once in a while a recoil system is out, you have to replace it. Every once in a while a tube burns out, but they're easily replaced. We used to replace them in the jungle in Vietnam without any great effort. It's a very rugged weapon. The big problem is that it's not very good if the enemy is in armored vehicles, because the projectile is really too small to, the explosive capacity is too light to really do much with an armored vehicle. But it's a very effective weapon against anything but an armored vehicle. The 105 howitzer is no longer the basic direct support weapon of division. Because of the lightweight of the projectile, we've gone to 155 howitzers, and almost all the 155 howitzers are self-propelled, and they're the new model, the Paladin, that I just described. The 8-inch howitzer has been withdrawn, mostly because of ammunition problems. The 8-inch howitzer projectile is 200 pounds. The 155 projectile is about 45 pounds. So just that alone says something about 155 howitzer. We now have rocket-assisted projectiles for the 155 howitzer, which gives it a greater range than the 8-inch. So the 8-inch, unfortunately, is being retired. I think there's still 2 battalions left in the reserve, 2 towed battalions. I think all the self-propelled battalions are gone. World War II taught us a number of lessons. It taught us that field artillery is important. It taught us really that the combined arms team is what wins wars. Field artillery doesn't win wars. Infantry doesn't win wars. Tankers don't win wars. But the combination of all 3 are what really win wars. The techniques which were developed in World War II were further developed in the late 40s, early 50s. In the 50s, 1950 actually, we developed a fire direction center where we could much more accurately develop target data and data to place on the howitzers to make the target hit. Some of you may remember the old graphical firing tables, which existed back in World War I and World War II. Only are all the data necessary to fire a howitzer. In other words, if you want to fire 3,500 yards, 3,500 meters, you set the elevation at 220.6, etc. Now, you're not very fast if you've got to look it up in the book. So in the 50s, graphical firing tables were developed, slipsticks, which did essentially the same thing. And at the same time, to do survey, we had military slide rules. Some of us remember what a slide rule is. I asked an 18-year-old grandson a few months ago, I said something about slide rule, and he looked blank. He doesn't know what a slide rule is because everything is done by computer today. So all this stuff became obsolete as computers came in. Field artillery had a tough time in the 60s and 70s and 80s coming up with a computer that actually would work. When we had vacuum tubes, it was just too rough. Drive down the road with something, a truckload of equipment with vacuum tubes in it, and nothing works for the next 6 hours. Now, with microprocessors and all that, those problems have been solved. In 1977, a young major working for me in the brigade I commanded had a Hewlett-Packard scientific calculator, which in those days cost about $200. Very expensive by today's standards. And he was able to program it so that it did about 80% of what you did with this book or with the graphical firing tables. So I thought it was such a good idea, we wrote it up and sent it to Fort Sill. I was spending on the computers we had, the vacuum tube computers in the 70s, I was spending about $1,000 a quarter on each one just to keep it going. And I figured that we could buy one of these every quarter and throw it away and save an awful lot of money. Fort Sill came back and said that thank you very much for your input, but your idea is unacceptable because the Hewlett-Packard is not fungus-proof and it's not painted olive drab, it's painted black. That was the answer we got. So 2 years passed. I was headed our liaison office with the German Army for 2 years. And then I went back to Fort Sill as the Deputy Assistant Commandant, the schoolmaster. And guess who I called to my office first? The head of the gunnery department. And he came in and said, yeah, I know what you're going to say. And I said, well, yeah, but he said, but it isn't fungus-proof. I said, I don't give a damn whether it's fungus-proof or not. If it gets fungus in it, throw it out and get another one. Well, we're all past that now because handheld calculators are not what we use. The computers are much smaller than handheld calculators in the vehicles and so forth. What World War II did was lay the foundation for what we can do today. The problem is that field artillery today has gotten very small again because you don't need all the people that we had in World War II. You don't need 21 men in the gun section for an 8-inch howitzer. The 155 self-propelled gun section now has 6 people in it. 2 of them drivers. There are 2 vehicles, 1 ammunition vehicle. The multiple launch rocket system, which is sort of taken the place of the 8-inch howitzer in many ways, has a crew of 3. So a battery, instead of having 127 in, has 65 or 70. So our units have gotten much smaller. And then because the range of these weapons has increased, you don't need as many weapons because you can mass fires across the battlefield greater distances much more accurately than in the past. I'm going to stop here and see if you have any questions. I also brought, for those field artillerymen who are interested, I brought some old field manuals. Some of them you might find interesting. One is a gunner's instruction from 1917, and my first battery exec handbook. Everybody remember a battery exec handbook? In fact, it has they changed our serial numbers to Social Security numbers. Now they're having problems with that because of the right to privacy and all that. But in the old days, you had serial numbers that ran consecutively. Mine was 017074, which meant I was 71,074 files after John J. Pershing. He was 1. He was 01. And MacArthur was 02. But anyway, that's human interest because it was on the front of the book. Anyway, they're here, but I'm happy to answer any questions or anything else. And I would also be happy to discuss anything else that might be on your minds now, since we seem to be in the middle of a war. Yes.
Sir, it's not a question, but I was taught as a Florida observer. We used to use the keyword wallet,
Yeah.
running order, azimuth, location, nature, target, use request type of control. Could they do that today?
Sure.
You think?
Yeah.
Because I was at a seminar one time, and they had all these computers. I said, what do you do if your battery goes dead?
Well,
These guys didn't know how to use field glasses.
when I went back to Sill in 80, that was the question they asked. I said, what's the backup system? And the backup system, we were going to computers. The backup system was the old fire direction system, chart tables and all that. I said, after 6 months of non-use, the chart table will be used for something else. People will forget how to use all this stuff. I said, you need a system where in extremis, the battery commander can fire his battery, as he did in World War I and early World War II, in his head, CAFS, Fort, and so forth. And that's basically what they've done. And the course that lieutenants get now are gunnery fundamentals course, theory of ballistics and things like that. They still get forward operator, duties of forward operator. They still have to go out. They don't fire as many missions as they used to, but they still have to go out and demonstrate. And they've got to be able to, they have the familiarization with the computers because the enlisted men who actually do the punching. But they go out and they have to be able to demonstrate that they can actually fire a battery while the computer shut down. So they're still doing it. The problem though is with the latest, with the Paladin, it's extremely difficult to fire it manually because we've moved so far from push a button and pull a line. So if the electrical system goes down, there's no way to make it go. And they say, well, it won't drive either. Well, but it'd be nice to be able to be a stationary target and shoot back. So we still have a lot of things like that that have to be worked out. I understand in Iraq, a lot of those have been worked out because in combat forces, you do a lot of things that you talk about, not really move on.
In the back.
Yes.
I got in a little late. You probably already answered this, but can you tell me the define the difference between the howitzer and the gun?
Yes. A gun is a weapon with a relatively low trajectory, a relatively long range, and a relatively long barrel. A howitzer can fire as a gun, but it also can fire higher than 45 degrees. It has a relatively short barrel, a lower muzzle velocity, and because of that, a shorter range for the same size projectile. The advantage of a howitzer is that you can fire very high trajectory like a mortar, and you can drop rounds relatively close to you, say behind a hill, where a gun can't because they hold mass. So there's a utility to have both kinds of weapons. But the meaning, it's gotten less and less meaningful over the years because the tube on the 155 howitzer today is as long as the tube on the 155 gun 25 years ago. And because of the way it's constructed, you can elevate the tube to 90 degrees, whereas the 155 gun you couldn't because it was manual, and when you got it up to about 30, 35 degrees, the gear system just wouldn't support it anymore. So now the difference is the distinction is losing its difference, I suppose, today. Yes.
I had two questions going back to one of the notes you had in your slide concerning the capturing of enemy weapons during World War II.
Yeah.
There seems to me, I was recently in Israel, where the theater there is very confined, and artillery has to be real accurate. So I had two questions. One is, does it make sense, and I think it does, not to be subjective, to take lessons learned from other militaries in regard to artillery? And the other would be, is it seemed to me the Mujahideen in Afghanistan were very mobile with their artillery, very innovative. And I guess what I would always say is we need to think out of the box.
No,
And in those two instances, is there something that we could learn for our military?
I think you're absolutely right. After the 1973 war,
Right.
we spent a great deal of time and effort with the Israelis going over lessons learned. A lot of the things we do now are a direct result of the lessons that were developed at that time. Because at that time, the Israeli Defense Force was very professional, very good, and you're correct, they have to work in a very small area.
Right.
So they didn't have the luxury of being able to just shoot more or less. And we have made it in the U.S. Army in the last 15 years. We made after-action reports and lessons learned almost a fetish. Now, I don't mean that negatively,
No.
but it's, for instance, at the National Training Center at Fort Irwin, the critiques are longer than the actual exercise. Because, again, it's an automated battlefield, instrumented battlefield, and you know exactly who did what when. It's not a question of somebody coming back and either denigrating their performance or exaggerating their performance. You know exactly what happened. And if a tank is hit, electronically the tank is shut down. And an umpire's got to acquire the key to start it. So you can't say bang, bang, you're dead. No, you didn't hit me.
Right.
You're out. And all the troops wear sensors on their helmets and on their jackets so that you can shoot at them and hit them. That's it. But those lessons have been integrated into training, and they're integrated into training almost instantaneously because they're available instantaneously. And they have big payoff in the initial attack in Iraq. That was done basically by the book with few casualties and work.
The other follow-up was, by contrast, when you go to northern Israel, southern Lebanon, and the Golan, the Israelis have this superior technology, and the artillery is pinpoint. You still have rudimentary guerrilla warfare that's effective also. And the other question is, there's still, even though they may not have the technology, whether it's the Mujahideen in Afghanistan or the Hezbollah, in Lebanon, they're flexible, and with rudimentary technology, they can still inflict damage.
Oh yeah, no, that's right. In fact, we're learning the hard way that a fairly primitive military force can do a lot of damage if they're innovative. And this business of roadside
Right.
roadside mines, very difficult to stop them.
Well, I guess my point is psychologically, no matter how much technology you have, when you go to bed at night, you have somebody who's willing to blow themselves up.
Yeah, that's right.
Difficult defense.
Yeah, I mean, it's if somebody really wants to kill themselves, it's very difficult to well, you can stop them, but it's very difficult to prevent them from killing themselves. Sir?
There's still a blockhouse on Signal Mountain.
There is still a blockhouse on Signal Mountain.
Tell these non-artillery people what that.
No, there was a blockhouse built on Signal Mountain in the 1870s to warn of Indian attack. And that Signal Mountain is one of the prominent terrain features. Signal Mountain is about 2,500 feet, 2,000 feet high. Not a great big mountain, but it's in the middle of the impact area. And on Signal Mountain, there is a blockhouse, and then there's a World War I 155 GPF with the tube sticking up in the air, and a couple of other artifacts. And You get an Article 15 if you hit the blockhouse. That's a no-no.
But all references are from the blockhouse on
Yeah,
signal down.
in basic, lieutenant's forward observer classes, take as a reference point blockhouse signal mountain, from blockhouse signal mountain, go left 360 degrees and down from the skyline 360 degrees will put you on blockhouse signal mountain. If you shoot at it, you're dead. That kind of stuff. No, that's a famous location, and then there are a few other things out there that, of course, they've extended the range quite a bit in recent years. What's interesting about Fort Sill for the field artillery test